The day Annie Chandler buried her husband, the sky above Caldwell County, Kansas was the color of a bruise, and she told herself she would not cry again after they lowered Thomas into the red earth. And she never did, not once, not in the 2 years that followed, while everything she had ever known slowly came apart at the seams. It was the spring of 1879 when Thomas Chandler died, thrown from his horse on the eastern ridge of their property during a thunderstorm that came up fast off the plains without warning. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a laugh that carried across 3 fields. He left behind Annie, who was 31, their son Eli, who was 9, and 420 acres of Kansas grassland that neither of them had ever managed alone. The ranch was called the Double C, though Thomas had never bothered with a proper sign. He always said the land knew its own name. Annie knew how to cook, how to mend, how to ride well enough to move cattle from one pasture to another, and how to keep books. What she did not know how to do was fix fence posts that had rotted through their bases, mend the roof of the barn when the shingles split and warped, redig an irrigation trench when the spring flood silted it over, or convince a dozen cows that their water trough was worth walking to when the wheel on the windmill had cracked and stopped turning. She knew those things needed doing. She just did not ask for help doing them. People tried. Her nearest neighbor, a stout German woman named Marta Brecht, brought over strudel 3 times in that first month and offered her husband Carl's hands for a week. Annie thanked her warmly, declined politely, and shut the door. The preacher from the First Methodist in Caldwell came out personally on a gray mare and suggested that the church could organize a work party. Annie stood on the porch and shook her head with such quiet finality that the preacher turned his mare around without dismounting. The banker, a small, precise man named Holloway, rode out in a buggy in the autumn of 1878 and explained gently that the note on the ranch would need to be addressed by spring, and that he knew several capable men looking for land to purchase. Annie Chandler looked at Holloway over the railing of her porch with eyes the color of winter sage and said, "Mr. Holloway, this land belonged to my husband, and it belongs to me and to my son now, and I would sooner plant myself in it next to Thomas than sell 1 acre of it to a stranger. Good day." Holloway drove away and came back twice more over the course of the next year, and each time Annie said something equally definitive, and each time she returned inside and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the books and tried to find a number that would save her and could not find one. The land showed it. By the summer of 1879, the south fence had 4 sections down completely, and the cattle had drifted that direction and wandered onto the open range beyond. She recovered most of them, but 3 were gone, and she did not have the money to replace them. The barn roof leaked through the winter, and she lost 2 sacks of oat grain to mildew. The windmill turned on 3 of its 8 blades, and the water trough only filled halfway on a good day. The irrigation channel to the kitchen garden had filled with silt, and she watered by hand each morning from the creek, carrying buckets up the slope before the sun got high. The front porch was missing 2 boards that Eli had fallen through the previous autumn, cutting his knee badly, and Annie had nailed a plank over the gap as a temporary measure that had now survived 2 seasons as a permanent one. Inside the house, though, Annie kept things clean and warm and steady. The kitchen smelled of biscuits in the morning and wood smoke at night. Eli had his lessons at the kitchen table every afternoon, working through the McGuffey readers that Thomas had ordered from St. Louis the year before he died. Annie read to him from a volume of Tennyson every evening before he slept, even on the nights when she was so tired her voice went rough and she had to clear her throat between stanzas. Whatever was falling apart outside, inside she held the line. She told herself she would find a way. She told herself it every morning with the same conviction with which other women said their prayers, and she told herself it at night when the coyotes called across the dark flats and Eli slept soundly, and the silence of the house pressed in around her like a second skin. She did not know what the way was, but she held the line. Isaiah Dawson first saw the double C from the road in early April of 1880, and what he saw was a place that had been beautiful once and was trying to die quietly. He was 36 years old, 6 feet and an inch, with dark skin weathered by years of sun and wind, hands that were broad and rough across the knuckles, and a way of looking at broken things that was less about pity and more about calculation. He rode a strong bay horse named Copper and carried everything he owned in 2 saddlebags and a bedroll, which was a fair amount less than most men his age and twice as much as he needed. He had come up from Texas, where he had spent 7 years working cattle drives along the Kishom Trail before the work dried up as the railheads pushed further west and the long drives got shorter and the trail bosses got younger and meaner with their wages. Before that he had been a Buffalo soldier with the 10th Cavalry out of Fort Concho, mustered out in 1872 after 4 years of service that had taken him across more of the Southwest than he had ever imagined when he enlisted at 18 in Louisville, Kentucky. He had seen the best and worst of the frontier, had been shot at by Comanche raiders, had ridden through blizzards on the Llano Estacado, had once pulled a drowning man from the Pecos River in the middle of February, while the ice ran in sheets against his legs, and had survived all of it with a calm that men mistook for coldness until they knew him better. What he was looking for in Kansas was land. Not to own exactly. He knew the realities of what a black man could and could not achieve in the way of land ownership in 1880, and he was not a man who wasted energy in bitterness over what the law and custom conspired to deny him, though he noticed it every single day with a precision that never dulled. What he wanted was work. Real work, the kind that was tied to a place and a purpose, not the endless drifting from one season to the next that the cattle drives had become. He had a cousin in Wichita who had written to him about farms along the Chicaskia River Valley that needed hands, and Isaiah was heading there when he saw the double C and stopped. He stopped because of the fence. Specifically, he stopped because of a section of fence on the far southern edge of the property that had not merely fallen down, but had been down for so long that the grass had grown up through the wire in thick green tufts, and the posts had begun to sink at angles back into the earth, as if the land itself were slowly reclaiming them. It was the kind of neglect that told a story, and Isaiah Dawson had always been a man who listened to what things told him. He sat on Copper at the edge of the road and looked at the fence for a long time. Then he looked at the rest of what he could see of the property, the distant barn with its wavy roofline, the windmill whose blades were visibly incomplete even from half a mile, the grassland that had been good grazing land and still was, underneath the overgrowth, if someone put the work into it. He could see no cattle in this southern section. He could see no one at all. He did not knock on any door. He did not ask permission. He rode Copper off the road and down the long slope to the creek line at the southern boundary, unsaddled the horse and let him drink, and then he walked back up to the downed fence and began pulling up the rotted posts. He had no wood. He could not set new posts that day. What he could do was clear the wire, straighten what was salvageable, pull the sunk posts out of the ground and stack them in a row so he could see how many replacements he would need, and walk the full line of the fence to assess where else it was compromised. He did all of these things through the afternoon with the methodical patience of a man who understood that you could not fix everything at once, and that the only way to get to the far end of a problem was to start at the near end and keep moving. By evening, he had walked the entire south fence line, which ran nearly a quarter mile, and had stacked 14 rotted posts and counted the wire gaps. He ate his supper from his saddlebag sitting on a flat rock by the creek, and then he rolled out his bedroll under a cottonwood and slept. He was back at it before sunrise. Annie saw him on the 3rd day. She had been carrying the morning water buckets up from the creek, and she came around the rise that blocked the view of the south pasture and stopped dead when she saw a man working the fence line a good 300 yards away. Her first reaction was alarm. Her hand went to the handle of the knife she kept at her belt, a reflex she had developed in the months after Thomas died, and then she stood very still and watched him. He was setting posts. He had new cedar posts. She could see them even from this distance, pale against the brown winter grass, and he was working a post-hole digger with a rhythm that spoke of long practice, driving it into the ground in a clean circular motion, pulling, driving, pulling, until the hole was deep enough, then dropping the post in and tamping the earth back around it with the heel of a wood mallet. He was working west to east, which meant he had started at the far corner of the property and was working toward the house. She put her water buckets down carefully so they would not spill and stood on the rise watching him for a full 10 minutes. He did not look up. He did not seem aware of her at all. He just worked methodically and steadily, moving from one post to the next. She picked her buckets back up, continued to the garden, watered the early spring greens, and went back to the house without confronting him. She was not afraid of him exactly. She was not sure what she was. She was deeply aware that the south fence had been down for 18 months and that someone was fixing it without being asked, which was the most complicated thing she could think of at that moment. At supper she told Eli there was a man working the south fence. Eli looked up from his biscuit with the bright directness of a 10-year-old. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Annie said. "Did you go ask him?" "Not yet." "Why not?" She looked at her son for a moment. He had Thomas's eyes, brown and steady, and Thomas's directness too, the kind that skipped past politeness and landed right on the truth. "I'm going to," she said. "Tomorrow." She did not go the next morning. She watched him from the rise again. He had strung wire on the section he had posted and was moving further east, carrying the new posts on his shoulder 2 at a time. He was a large man and he moved with an economy that she found, against her better judgment, impressive. At some point in the mid-morning she had to stop watching because she had her own work to do, and watching a man fix her fence was not work. She went the following morning. She had Eli with her, which she told herself was practical. He needed to get out of the house and she needed to check the creek level, and which was also, she admitted to herself, somewhere underneath the practical explanation, a way of not going entirely alone. The man was working wire, bent over the fence with a pair of pliers, twisting wire around the post she had watched him set 2 days ago. He heard her coming. She did not try to be quiet and straightened up and turned around, and she looked at him and he looked at her. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and even. "Morning," she said. She kept walking until she was 10 feet from him and stopped. "This is my land." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He held the pliers at his side without any particular tension. "Those are my fence posts." He glanced at the posts. "No, ma'am, those are posts I bought from the lumber yard in Caldwell. Your posts are that stack over there." He nodded toward the pile of rotted cedar she had seen him pull from the ground. 14 of them, all rotted through at the base. I pulled them so I could see the full damage." She looked at the stack. "You bought cedar posts out of your own pocket." "I did." "Why?" He considered this the way a man considers a question that has a long answer and decides which part of the answer is the right one to give. "Because the fence needed fixing," he said. "And because I was here and had the time and the tools." "You don't have my permission," she said. "No, ma'am, I don't," he agreed, without any sign of defensiveness. "You're welcome to tell me to stop, but the fence will still be down if I do." She studied him. He was looking at her with a directness that was not aggressive and not submissive, simply present, the way a man looks when he has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. He was older than she had guessed from a distance, and there were lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, and his hands on the pliers were the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his adult life. "What's your name?" she asked. "Isaiah Dawson." "Annie Chandler," she said, "and this is my son Eli." Eli, who had been standing a little behind her and studying Isaiah with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child, said, "You're a Buffalo Soldier." Isaiah looked at the boy with a small, surprised expression that shifted into something warmer. "I was," he said. "How did you know that?" "You've got the cavalry posture," Eli said, which was something he had heard his father say once about a man they had met, and he had stored it because it sounded important. "Papa said you can always tell." "Your papa sounds like a man who paid attention," Isaiah said. "He's dead," Eli said, with the directness of a child who has said a thing so many times that the rawness has been worn off the edges of it. "I know," Isaiah said. "I'm sorry for it." Annie looked at him. "How do you know?" "The state of the land tells me. A working ranch with a man running it wouldn't have a fence down 18 months. He said it without any trace of accusation, just as simple as a man might report the weather. Whatever happened, it was a man who kept this place, and now it's being kept by someone who's doing the best they can alone." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a great deal of conclusion from a fence line." "I've read a lot of fence lines," he said. She looked at the wire he had strung, the posts he had set, the careful work of it, all the care that had gone into what no one but the cattle would notice. Then she looked at him again. "You can keep going," she said. "I'm not saying thank you yet." "I'm not asking for it," he said, and turned back to his work. She walked back toward the house with Eli trotting alongside her, and the boy said, "He seems all right." "He seems capable," Annie said, which was the closest she was willing to come to agreement. Over the next 2 weeks, Isaiah worked his way up the length of the south fence and turned the corner onto the west line. He camped by the creek each night and worked from sunup to mid-afternoon, then spent the last hours of daylight doing smaller tasks, clearing brush from the fence line, resetting a corner post that had been poured badly, stretching the old wire so it sat true. He rode into Caldwell twice for supplies, and both times Annie watched him go from the porch without saying anything. She began to leave food at the top of the creek rise. A plate of biscuits the first time, covered with a cloth. A wedge of salt pork, wrapped in paper the second time. She did not leave a note, and she did not acknowledge it to him directly, and he did not mention it to her, but the plates came back clean each time and set carefully on the flat rock where she had left them. Eli started wandering down to watch him in the afternoons, with Annie's grudging permission. She told Eli not to pester him, and Eli said he wouldn't, and he proceeded to ask Isaiah approximately 40 questions per afternoon starting on the first day. Isaiah answered them all. He answered questions about the Kishom Trail and the proper technique for setting a corner post, and whether buffalo were really as big as people said, and what it was like in Texas, and how you told north without a compass, and what happened when you got caught in a blizzard. He answered them while he worked, not stopping, not performing for the boy, but simply talking the way a man talks when he's comfortable with the company. And Eli absorbed every word with the intensity of a 10-year-old who had been without a man to talk to for 2 years. Annie saw it happening from the rise and felt something shift in her chest that she did not look at directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun. On a Thursday in late April, she walked down to where Isaiah was working the west fence. He had made it to the midpoint of the west line now, and she sat down on a fence post he had not yet set and said, "The windmill is broken." He paused his work and looked at her. "I know. I can see it from the south pasture. The cotter pin on the main shaft cracked and the wheel wobbles when it does turn at all. One of the blades snapped off last winter." She was looking at the fence, not at him. "The water trough is only running at half capacity. In summer that will be a problem for the cattle." "It will," he agreed. "I don't have money to hire a windmill man from town." "You don't need a windmill man," he said. "You need a new cotter pin and a replacement blade and someone who doesn't mind going up a ladder." She looked at him then. "Are you offering?" "I'm stating what's needed," he said. "Whether you take it as an offer is up to you." She pressed her lips together and looked back at the fence. "I don't like being dependent," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have not asked anyone for help in 2 years, and I have managed." "I can see that you have," he said, and there was nothing condescending in it, nothing soft. "I can also see what's cost you." "Everything has a cost," she said sharply. "Yes," he said, "but not everything costs the same." They were both quiet. A meadowlark was calling from somewhere in the new spring grass, a liquid 3-note phrase repeated over and over into the morning. "I'll pay you," she said. "When I can, I'll keep a ledger." "That's fine," he said. You can sleep in the bunkhouse. It hasn't been used since my husband died. It'll need airing out." She stood up and smoothed her skirt. "There's a stove in it and a cot. Eli can show you where it is." Isaiah looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Chandler." "Don't," she said. "Not yet." But there was something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one either, and she walked back up toward the house with her shoulders straight and her chin level, and Isaiah watched her go for just a moment before he turned back to the fence. The bunkhouse smelled of dust and mouse droppings and old leather, and Isaiah spent the first evening cleaning it out with a thoroughness that would have surprised anyone who thought of cowboys as men who lived with dirt. He beat the cot mattress outside and hung it over the rail in the evening breeze, swept the floor twice, wiped down the stove and checked its pipe for blockage, and stacked his own gear in the corner with military precision. By the time he lit the stove for the first time, the place was livable, and by the time he went to sleep it was something close to orderly. He fixed the windmill on a Friday. He rode into Caldwell Wednesday morning and came back with a new cotter pin and a length of cedar board he shaped into a blade with a draw knife by the light of the bunkhouse lantern that night. Thursday he spent finishing the cedar blade and sanding it smooth, shaping its angle with a care that Eli, who watched the entire process from the bunkhouse doorway, found deeply impressive. Friday morning he climbed the windmill. Annie stood in the yard and watched him go up with the new blade balanced across his shoulder and her heart in her throat, though she would not have admitted the throat part. The ladder on the windmill was old and she had told him so, and he had checked every rung before ascending, and now he moved up it with a steadiness that she tracked from below until he reached the platform and began his work. It took him the better part of 2 hours. He replaced the cotter pin first, working in the wind that picked up at the top of the structure and made the remaining blades creak and spin in quarter turns around him. Then he fitted the new cedar blade into the hub and bolted it true and sat up there for a moment, 60 feet above the Kansas plains, and looked out at the land spread below him. From up there he could see the shape of the whole double C, the house and the yard, the barn with its still imperfect roof, the pastures running east toward the road, the creek line in the south, the fence lines he had repaired. It was a good piece of land. It had been well chosen once by someone who understood what to look for. He came back down, and the windmill began to turn properly within the hour, all 8 blades catching the west wind in clean sequence, and the water trough filled by afternoon. Annie watched the water level rising in the trough and felt something so close to relief that it ached. She had not let herself acknowledge how much she had been worrying about it until the worry lifted, and the lifting of it felt like setting down something heavy she had carried so long she'd forgotten the weight of it. She went to the barn door where Isaiah was storing his tools and said, "Thank you, that's the first time I've said that." He looked around. "I noticed." "I mean it," she said, genuinely. "I know you do," he said. "That's why it was worth saying." She leaned against the barn doorframe and looked at the windmill, still turning, its sound now the familiar steady clacking she remembered from before Thomas died. "My husband put that windmill up in 1873, she said. "Took him and his brother a whole week. His brother fell off the ladder twice and wasn't hurt either time, which Thomas always said was God looking after fools and children." Isaiah set down the wrench he was holding and sat on the workbench. "Where's the brother now?" "Missouri. He came for the funeral and wrote twice after, and then life goes its own directions." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you have family?" "A mother in Louisville, a cousin in Wichita, scattered relations across several states." He said it without self-pity. "The Army and the trail drives move a man around to the point that keeping close ties takes more effort than most families are prepared to put in." "That's lonely," she said before she thought about it. He looked at her steadily. "So is keeping a ranch going alone," he said, "but here we both are." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she had intended, then straightened away from the doorframe. "Supper is at 6, she said. "I'll set an extra plate," he said. I'd be obliged." She turned and walked back across the yard toward the house, and this time she did not look back at him, but her step was lighter than it had been when she came. Supper at the Chandler table was a formidable affair even in lean times. Annie cooked with the intensity of someone who had decided that whatever else fell apart, no one at her table would go hungry. There were salt pork chops, a pot of beans with a ham hock that had been simmering since morning, cornbread in a cast iron pan, pickled beets from last year's garden, and a jar of the apple preserves she had put up in September. Isaiah ate with the gratitude of a man who had survived on his own camp cooking for 7 years, and sat across the kitchen table from a real meal feeling something unknot in him that he hadn't known was knotted. Eli talked through most of the meal. He told Isaiah about the school in Caldwell, which he attended 3 days a week when the weather allowed, and about the teacher, a young woman named Miss Pierce who was from Ohio and was very strict about handwriting. He told Isaiah about the time their neighbors, the Breck's bull, got out and ended up standing in the middle of the road to Caldwell for 2 hours, while Carl Breck tried to move him from behind, and the bull stood there with the enormous self-satisfaction of an animal who knew he was bigger than everybody. He asked Isaiah if he had ever met a real outlaw on the trail. Isaiah said he had met several men who called themselves outlaws, and found that the word was generally more romantic than the reality. "Were they scary?" Eli said. "Some of them were dangerous," Isaiah said. "That's different from scary. Scared men are the ones you watch out for. Dangerous men you can usually read if you pay attention." "How do you read them?" "The same way you read anything," Isaiah said. "You watch what they do more than what they say." Annie, who had been quiet through most of the meal and content to listen, looked up at that and found Isaiah looking at her, not in any pointed way, just the way he looked at things as though he was paying attention. She looked back down at her plate. After supper, Eli did his reading lesson at the table while Annie washed the plates, and Isaiah, without being asked, dried them and stacked them on the shelf. Annie did not comment on this. Eli read aloud from the McGuffey Fourth Reader about a boy named Philip who helped an old man cross a flooding river, which Eli found admirable and slightly implausible, and Annie and Isaiah listened to him read with the comfortable shared attention of adults in a kitchen at the end of a long day. When Eli had gone to bed, Annie sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of her, a habit of evening accounting that she maintained even when the numbers were grim. Isaiah put on his hat and said good night and was at the door when she said, "The barn roof." He turned back. 2 sections are letting water in, over the grain storage and over the east stall. She was looking at the ledger, not at him. "I can't afford new shingles, but I have cedar boards in the barn that Thomas cut last summer before that were cut 2 years ago. They might do for patchwork." "I'll look at it in the morning," Isaiah said. She nodded and went back to the ledger, and he went out into the night. The stars above the Kansas plains were brilliant in that way they get in April, before the summer haze builds, each one sharp and clear as a pin pushed through black paper. He stood for a moment outside the bunkhouse door and looked up at them and thought about the table and the kitchen and the boy reading and the woman with her ledger, and something in him that had been looking for a direction for a very long time felt, with a quiet certainty that surprised him, that it might have found one. May came in fast and warm, and the work on the Double C accelerated with the season. Isaiah patched the barn roof with the cedar boards and a combination of old tar and new nails, working in sections so the barn was never left fully exposed, and finished in 4 days. He rebuilt the irrigation channel to the kitchen garden, a 2-day job that required shifting a good deal of heavy clay and stone, and that transformed the morning water carry from an hour of heavy labor to a 5-minute task that turned a wheel and let the gravity do the work. Annie watched him root the new channel and did not say anything about the ingenuity of it, but she stood there looking at it when it ran the first time with an expression that Isaiah read correctly as a form of very deep relief. He began work on the porch boards. This was the smallest of the jobs, but it was the one closest to the house, and therefore the one that required the most negotiation of a different kind. The kind that existed between a man and a woman in the narrow territory of domesticity. He pulled up the old plank Annie had nailed over the gap, measured and cut new boards from the lumber he bought in Caldwell, and fitted and nailed them with the same care he gave everything. While he worked, Annie was often in the kitchen with the door open, and they talked through the doorway about the garden, about the price of beef at the Caldwell stockyards, about whether the late rains were going to be good for the grass or too much of a good thing. The conversations were practical at first, and then they became something else, gradually, and without either of them marking exactly when the change happened. She told him about coming to Kansas with Thomas in 1869, newly married and 21 years old, on a wagon from Illinois with everything they owned in it, and a mule named Arthur who had a profound personal objection to rivers and had to be blindfolded to cross the Kaw. Isaiah laughed at this, a real laugh, not a polite one, and Annie looked up from her mending at the sound of it and felt something warm move through her. He told her about the cavalry, about the campaigns and the prairies and the strangeness of being a black soldier in a white army serving a country that had not long ago treated men who looked like him as property. He said it without bitterness but without softening it either, and she listened with the full attention of someone who understood that a thing being hard to hear was no reason to turn away from it. "My mother's mother was born in bondage," he said one evening on the porch, the two of them sitting in the chairs Thomas had made from bent willow branch. "She never spoke of it to us, but she had a way of holding herself very upright, very contained, that my mother said came from a life spent not being allowed to take up space. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to take up space in the world." Annie was quiet for a moment, listening to the night insects. "You take up space," she said, "just not loudly." He looked at her. "That's a kind thing to say." "It's an accurate thing to say," she said, which was her preferred variety of kindness, and he heard the distinction and smiled. Eli, who had been sitting on the newly repaired porch boards at their feet, whittling at a stick with his pocket knife and pretending not to listen to the adult conversation, looked up and said, "Are you going to stay, Mr. Dawson?" The question landed between the adults like a stone in still water, and the rings it made moved outward through the warm evening air. Isaiah looked at the boy and then at Annie and then back at the boy. "That's not entirely my decision," he said. Eli looked at his mother. Annie looked at her hands in her lap. "Go to bed, Eli," she said, not unkindly. Eli went in the way children go when they have planted exactly the thing they meant to plant and know when to leave it alone. Annie and Isaiah sat in the quiet. The windmill turned in the night breeze, its familiar sound steady and unhurried. After a while she said, "The east fence still needs work, the north corner especially." "I know," he said. "I was going to start it Monday." "Then I suppose you're staying through Monday," she said. And there was something in it that was neither a question nor a declaration but was most accurately described as a door left slightly open, and he heard it that way and said, "I suppose I am." And they sat together in the warm Kansas night while the stars turned overhead, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things say themselves more clearly in silence. June arrived, and with it the real heat of a Kansas summer, dry and direct and unequivocal. Isaiah had made it through the north fence line and turned the corner onto the east, which meant he had now repaired 3 of the 4 fence lines and was working toward completion of the 4th. He had also, in the margins of the major projects, repaired the chicken coop that had been listing badly on one corner, replaced the rusted pump handle on the well near the house, built a new gate for the cattle pen using hinges he had fashioned from heavy strap iron, and rerouted a section of the creek channel that had been undercutting the bank and threatening the near pasture. The Double C looked different. It looked like a ranch again. Annie began to understand that her pride had cost her 2 years that it should not have cost her, and she sat with that understanding in the mornings while she drank her coffee on the newly solid porch and watched the sun come up over the east pasture, and felt the particular ache of a lesson learned too late, or perhaps not too late, or perhaps exactly on time. She had not been wrong to want to manage alone. She had not been wrong to resist the neighbors and the preacher and the banker. But she had perhaps confused needing help with being weak, and those were not the same thing, and it had taken Isaiah Dawson arriving from nowhere and starting at the far end of her fence line and working his way toward her to help her see the difference. She wrote it in her journal on a Sunday in June. He is the most quietly capable man I have ever known, and it frightens me only because nothing has frightened me in 2 years, and I had become accustomed to not being frightened. On a Tuesday in late June, the two of them were working together. She had begun helping with the east fence, holding posts level while he tamped the earth, which she told herself was practical and which was also, she admitted to her journal that night, an excuse to be near him, when Carl Brecht rode up on his big roan horse and pulled up 100 yards away and called out something. Annie straightened and shaded her eyes. "That's Carl Brecht," she said. Isaiah straightened too and watched. Brecht had not yet seen him. He was looking at Annie, and when he did see Isaiah, he paused in a way that was brief but readable. "Mrs. Chandler," Brecht called, riding closer. "Good morning. I came to check on, you have a hired man now." "Good morning, Mr. Brecht," Annie called. She did not answer the question yet, which was an answer in itself. "This is Isaiah Dawson. He's been working the ranch." Brecht dismounted and shook Isaiah's hand with the careful German formality of a man observing propriety in a situation he was assessing as he went. He was not unkind. Brecht was a decent man at his core. But he had lived in Kansas long enough to know that some people in the county would have opinions about a black man living and working on a widow woman's ranch, and those opinions would get expressed in various ways, not all of them subtle. Isaiah shook his hand and went back to the fence without ceremony, and Annie stepped over to talk to Brecht, and they spoke in low voices about something for several minutes. Isaiah worked and did not listen, which was not difficult for a man who had spent years learning the discipline of staying in his own lane when it suited the situation. Later, back at the house over the midday meal, Annie said, "Brecht offered to buy the south pasture." Isaiah looked up. "He's been wanting it for 2 years," she said. "It borders his property. He made a fair offer. Are you going to take it?" "No," she said. "That's Thomas's south pasture. Eli will have it." She cut a piece of pork chop with more force than strictly necessary. "But he meant it kindly. He's a good neighbor." "He looked at me like he was adding up a sum," Isaiah said. "He was," Annie said without hesitation. "People will talk. They already are, I imagine. A woman alone with a man living on her property." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know that I am aware of it and I don't care about it." "You should care about it," he said. "Not for my sake, for yours. It can affect how people treat you in town. People in town already treat me like a woman on the edge of losing everything," she said. "That is a particular form of condescension that I have found indistinguishable from pity, and I don't require either." She set down her knife. "What I care about is that this ranch runs properly and that my son has land to inherit. Everything else can be managed." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a formidable woman, Annie Chandler." She blinked at the use of her first name. He had always said Mrs. Chandler before, and then she said, "I've had to be." "You don't have to be alone about it," he said, and then returned to his meal with the same straightforward calm he brought to everything, as if he had said nothing particularly momentous. She said nothing for the rest of the meal, but her eyes were bright. The summer turned in its slow burning arc, and July brought the heat that turned the Kansas grass to gold and the sky to a white blue that looked like something bleached. The cattle were doing better with the fence lines repaired and the water trough running full. They were properly contained and watered, and Annie had spoken to a man at the stockyards about selling 4 steers in the fall at a price that, combined with what she had in the bank, would pay off the note to Holloway. She told Isaiah this over supper one evening, and he listened carefully, and said the math looked right, and suggested that if she could sell 5 instead of 4, she would have a cushion going into winter. And they spent the better part of an hour at the kitchen table with the ledger and a lamp between them, working through the numbers the way two people work through a thing when they are genuinely thinking together. After the ledger was closed and the lamp turned down and the evening settling into quiet, Eli, who had been doing his reading at the end of the table, said without looking up from his book, "You two are like two farmers looking at the same field." Annie said, "Go to bed." Eli said, "I'm going," and gathered his book and went. And in the silence that followed, Annie was acutely aware that she was sitting 3 feet from Isaiah Dawson in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and that her hands were folded on the table in front of her and his were on the table too, and they were not touching but they were very near each other. "He notices things," Isaiah said, looking at the doorway through which Eli had gone. "He always has," Annie said. "He's very like his father in that way." Thomas could read a room before he was in it. "He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I knew," she said simply. "I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't make it smaller than it was by saying I am over it." "I wouldn't want you to," Isaiah said. She looked at him. "I'm not sure what I'm saying." "I think you're saying that loving someone who is gone doesn't mean you can't," he chose the word carefully, "care for someone else, but that it's complicated." "It's very complicated," she said. "Yes," he said, "but worth saying out loud sometimes." They looked at each other in the dimmed kitchen with the sound of the summer night coming through the open window, the crickets and the windmill and the distant call of a nighthawk. And Annie Chandler felt something she had not felt in 2 years and had not expected to feel again, which was the particular awareness of another person that is both a recognition and a question, and she did not look away from it. "Good night, Isaiah," she said finally. "Good night, Annie," he said, and went out into the July dark. She sat at the table for a while after he left, her hands still folded, looking at the closed ledger, and then she picked up her journal and wrote, "I believe I am in considerable difficulty. I believe I have been in it for some time. I am not certain that difficulty is the right word." July became August, and August brought a trouble that had been building on the horizon for several weeks, and finally arrived in the form of 2 men on horses who came up the road to the Double C on a hot Wednesday morning and turned in without being invited. Annie saw them from the kitchen window and went to the door. They were not men she recognized from town. They had the look of men who move through places rather than living in them, dust-covered and narrow in the eye. The larger one had a red beard that came to a point and a rifle in his saddle scabbard, and the smaller one stayed on his horse while the larger one dismounted and came to the porch. "Looking for a man named Dawson," he said. "Isaiah Dawson. Black fella big," Annie said. "Why?" "He owes a man some money, down in Texas." He said it pleasantly enough, but there was an edge beneath the pleasantness that Annie read clearly. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. The man with the red beard looked around the yard with a slow sweep, taking in the bunkhouse, the repaired barn, the windmill turning steadily. "Somebody's been doing a lot of work around here," he said. "Woman alone can't do all that." "I hired a work crew in the spring," Annie said evenly. "They finished last month and moved on. I don't take their names and I don't know where they go." He looked at her for a moment and then smiled, and the smile confirmed everything the edge had suggested. "Appreciate your time, ma'am," he said and remounted. They rode out slowly, and Annie watched them go down the road toward Caldwell, and then turned and walked to the barn where Isaiah was repairing a broken stall board and said, without preamble, "2 men just came asking for you." He stopped working. His face was very still. A big man with a red beard and a smaller one who stayed on his horse. She described them quickly and efficiently, and he listened with the focused attention of a man absorbing tactical information. "I told them I didn't know you," she said. "I said I'd hired a crew in the spring who had moved on." He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't," she said. "Are you in trouble? I want the truth." He set the stall board down and turned to face her fully. "There's a man in Texas named Akers who runs a cattle operation south of San Antonio. 3 years ago he hired me as his foreman, and then cheated me of my wages for 6 months, claimed I had damaged cattle on a drive, which was a lie. I left. He's put it around that I owe him for the cattle, which is his way of making sure I can't find legitimate work in Texas, and discouraging me from pursuing the wages he owes me. The men who came today, they're not law. They're just men who find people for money. She absorbed this. So there's no legal trouble. None, he said. But men like that don't need legal standing to be a problem. No, she said, they don't. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think they'll come back? If they believe you, he said. Maybe not. If they're persistent, possibly. She made a decision with the same clean directness she brought to everything. You'll keep working here, she said. If they come back, we'll deal with it. This is my land and you're my hired man and they have no business here. She paused. Have you written down what Acres owes you? He blinked. I have a record, yes. Keep it safe, she said. Someday that record might matter. She turned to go. Annie, she stopped. Thank you again. She looked back at him. Again, she confirmed and almost smiled, and went back to the house. The men did not come back, and life on the Double C continued its careful forward motion. The east fence was completed in the second week of August, which meant that Isaiah had now fully repaired all 4 fence lines of the Double C, the entire perimeter from the far south corner where he had started all those weeks ago, all the way around and back. Annie walked the south line one evening after supper alone, trailing her hand along the new wire, feeling the evenness of the tension in it, and felt something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled. She made a decision that night. She wrote it in her journal. I am going to speak to him plainly because I have never known how to do anything any other way, and it is past time. She found him the following morning at the workbench in the barn, cleaning and oiling his tools with the meticulous care of a man who respects what he works with. She stood in the barn door until he looked up, and then she walked over and stood across the workbench from him. I have something to say, she said. All right, he said, and set down the oilcloth. I don't want you to leave, she said. Not because there's still work to be done. There's always work on a ranch, and that will never change. I don't want you to leave because, she stopped and then pressed forward, because these 3 months have been the first time in 2 years that I have felt that I was not entirely alone in the world, and I am aware that you can't build a life on someone's absence of loneliness, but it is where things begin, I think. He was looking at her with full attention. I'm not asking you anything, she said. I don't want you to feel obliged. What you have done for this ranch is more than most men would have done, and you did it without being asked. And I understand that I am a complicated proposition. There is a ranch that is still in debt and a 10-year-old boy and the memory of a man I loved, and I am not a young woman starting fresh. I am a woman who has been through something and who has edges where there used to be softness. She stopped again, and for the first time in this conversation, her voice did something uncertain. But I think I might care for you, considerably more than is comfortable. Isaiah Dawson looked at Annie Chandler across a barn workbench scattered with oilcloths and wrench heads in August of 1880 in Caldwell County, Kansas, and felt his whole chest open up the way a field does when the sun clears the clouds. Annie, he said, I started fixing your fence 3 months ago from the farthest corner of your property because I didn't know how to knock on your door. She stared at him. What? I saw this land and I saw what it needed and I saw what it was, and I thought the person who chose this land chose well. The person who is holding this land together alone is someone worth knowing. And I didn't know how to walk up to your door and introduce myself to a woman who clearly doesn't need anything from anyone. So I started at the far end and worked my way toward you, and hoped that by the time I got close enough you might let me in. She was very still for a long moment, and he could see the emotion moving through her, not weeping. Annie Chandler was not a woman who wept easily, but something in the eyes, something in the way she was holding her breath. You fixed my fence, she said slowly, to get close to me. I fixed your fence because it needed fixing, he said, and I kept going because of you. She put her hands flat on the workbench and leaned on them, looking down at the grain of the wood. You are a very peculiar man, Isaiah Dawson, she said. I know, he said. She looked up, and there was something in her face he had not seen before, not the competence and the determination and the careful steadiness he had come to know, but something softer underneath all of those things, something that had been waiting behind them the way a spring waits under hard ground. "I think I might love you," she said. "I think I have been thinking it for some time and refusing to say it." He came around the end of the workbench and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and he said, "Then I'll tell you plainly too. I have been in love with you since the first morning I saw you walk up from the creek with your water buckets and stand on the rise looking at me for 10 minutes before you put your chin up and went back to your garden without saying a word." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "You saw me watching you." "Of course I did," he said. "You never let on." "You weren't ready," he said simply. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he went very still, and she looked at him. This man who had come from nowhere and started fixing things at the far edge of what was broken, and worked his way quietly and steadily toward her without ever demanding anything, and felt something she had thought was sealed close open like a window in spring air. He covered her hand with his and held it there, and they stood like that in the warm barn light. And then she leaned forward, and he leaned down, and they kissed in the slow, certain way of people who have been moving toward each other for a long time, and know they are not in a hurry anymore. When Eli came to find his mother because he had finished his morning lessons and wanted to know if there were any jobs for him, he came into the barn and stopped and assessed the scene with the same quick intelligence he brought to everything, and then turned around and walked out and went to see if the windmill needed checking. He was a very perceptive child. September came, the air turning with the first hint of the autumn that would follow, and with it came the Caldwell County Fall Market, where Annie took 5 steers and sold them at a price that, after settling the note with Holloway, left her with a remainder that was enough to see the ranch through a winter with money for seed in the spring. She came home from Caldwell that afternoon with the paid note in her hand and stood in the yard and held it, and then folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress, and felt the ground under her feet as if she were standing on it for the first time. Isaiah was at the barn. He had seen her ride in and could read the way she was standing. "Good day at the market," he called. She walked to him and held up the folded paper and said, "The note is paid." He took his hat off, which was the closest he usually came to ceremony. "Well done. We did it together," she said. "The ledger, all of it." She tucked the paper back. "The ranch is ours, mine, free and clear." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something uncertain in his expression, a rare thing on Isaiah Dawson's face. "Annie," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take it in the spirit in which it is meant and not feel any obligation in any direction." "All right," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I know what I am offering and what I am not. I don't have land of my own. I have a wage and a skill set and some modest savings, and I am not a man without complications given the color of my skin in this country and this time. I know there are people in this county who will have things to say, and I would not pretend otherwise." He held her gaze steadily. "But I love you, and I love that boy. And this land feels like home to me in a way that nothing else has since, before I was old enough to know what home meant." Annie Chandler looked at him in the September light and thought about the last 2 years, the loneliness and the determination, and the slow letting in of this man from the far edge of her life to the center of it. And then she said, "Isaiah Dawson, you fixed my fence. You fixed my windmill and my barn and my porch and my irrigation channel and every broken thing you could find on this property, and you did it without being asked, and then you had the patience to wait while I caught up to what you already knew." She stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers. "Do you think I would say no?" he breathed out slowly. "I had considered the possibility," he said. "You are a woman who says no quite readily." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep in the chest, and it rang out across the yard, and the windmill kept turning, and the cattle grazed in the properly fenced pastures, and the barn stood solid under its repaired roof, and the house waited warm and steady at the end of its proper porch. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in November on a clear, cold Saturday in the First Methodist in Caldwell. The preacher who had once ridden out to offer a work party looked at Annie Chandler coming down the aisle on Eli's arm. Eli, having informed them that he would do this, that it was his job, with such absolute certainty that no one argued and felt he understood something he hadn't when he'd made that first visit. Marta Brecht sat in the front pew and wept with the specific enthusiasm of a woman who had known all along this was going to happen. Her husband Carl sat beside her and shook Isaiah's hand afterward with a firmness that said, whatever his earlier reservations, the man before him had earned his respect. There were people in Caldwell who had things to say about a white widow marrying a black man, just as Isaiah had known there would be. Most of these things were said behind hands and not to anyone's face, which was the nature of most small-minded objections in a frontier town where daily survival required too much energy to leave a great deal left over for active cruelty. A few people were openly cold. The banker Holloway nodded when he passed them on the street, which was as close to endorsement as a man of his particular caution managed. Miss Pierce, Eli's school teacher from Ohio, came to the wedding and said that it was the most romantic thing she had witnessed in Kansas, which was a low bar, but she meant it sincerely. Annie and Isaiah faced what came toward them with the same practical directness they brought to everything else, which was to say that they did not seek confrontation and did not avoid it, and they kept their eyes on their own land and their own lives and built something solid. The first winter as a married couple was the kind of winter that tests a marriage long and hard, and isolating in the particular way of Kansas winters, when the wind comes down from the north and the temperature drops to 20 below and the snow comes horizontal and stays. But the barn roof held, and the windmill kept running, and the cattle had water, and the house was warm with the stove Isaiah had checked and refitted in October, and the woodpile he had stacked high enough that Annie looked at it and said she had never seen so much wood in her life. They spent the evenings by the stove, the three of them, Annie with her mending or her journal, Isaiah with whatever needed repairing or the almanac that he read with the same thoroughness he applied to fence lines, Eli with his books and his increasing collection of questions about everything. They played cards some evenings, a game called euchre that Isaiah had learned in the army and that Eli picked up in 3 lessons and proceeded to win at with a frequency that they both claimed was suspicious. In the long dark of January evenings, Isaiah told them about the places he had been: the Llano Estacado in West Texas, white and flat and vast as nothing Annie had ever imagined, the Guadalupe Mountains, the Caprock country where the land dropped off the high plains in a sudden escarpment that looked like the edge of the world. Annie told him about the crossing of the Kaw River with the mule Arthur blindfolded, in more detail than she had before, and the story of how she and Thomas had chosen the Double C. They had seen it from the road on a September morning in 1869, with the grass golden and the creek running clear, and Thomas had pulled the wagon up and looked for a long time and then looked at her and said, "This one," and she had said, "Yes, this one." And they had driven up to the house and found the previous owner glad enough to sell. "He chose well," Isaiah said. "He always did," she said, and there was no sadness in it now, only the easy accommodation of a life that had held grief and moved forward with it intact. She leaned her head briefly against Isaiah's shoulder, a new gesture, one she was still becoming accustomed to, the simple presence of another person to lean on, and he put his arm around her, and Eli looked up from his cards and then back down with the careful nonchalance of a boy practicing at being unsurprised. Spring came again, the second spring of Isaiah's presence on the Double C, and with it a series of developments both practical and personal that changed the shape of their lives considerably. The practical: Isaiah used his savings and Annie's remainder from the note settlement to purchase 12 additional head of cattle, sturdy Texas Longhorn stock from a reputable man in Wichita that Isaiah's cousin helped locate, and the herd was now large enough to be a real operation rather than a subsistence holding. Isaiah reached out through his cousin to a cattle association contact and secured a contract to supply a regular quantity of beef to the railroad camp at Wellington, which was building its line south and needed feeding. The Double C was, for the first time since Thomas Chandler had built it, genuinely profitable. The personal. In February, Annie told Isaiah, with characteristic directness and a slight elevation of color in her cheeks, that she was expecting a child. Isaiah sat very still for a moment and then said, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm 33 years old and I've done this before and I'm perfectly fine." "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him. This question coming from him was not a small one. He knew what she had built and what she held and what she had guarded, and he was asking not whether she was satisfied but whether this, added to all of it, was something she wanted. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to be." He pulled her into his arms and she let him, and they stood in the kitchen in the February morning while the snow blew past the window and Eli was at school in Caldwell and the house was very quiet and very warm. Eli, when told, said, "I knew." Annie said, "No, you didn't," he said. "You've been putting butter on everything for 2 months." Isaiah laughed. Annie decided she had no defense to this and simply changed the subject. The summer of 1881 was the best summer the Double C had seen in years. The grass came up thick and green from the spring rains. The herd was fat and healthy. The kitchen garden overflowed with the abundance of the properly irrigated soil. And the ranch had the look it must have had in its best years, before the fence lines went down and the windmill began to falter and the grief took hold. Isaiah had a conversation in July with a land agent in Caldwell about the possibility of acquiring the 80 acres that adjoined the Double C to the north, land that had been abandoned by a homesteader who had lost his nerve 2 winters back and returned east. The land was being held by the county for unpaid taxes and could be purchased at a figure that was ambitious but not impossible. He talked to Annie about it that evening on the porch, laying it out carefully: the cost, the advantage, the increased grazing range, the timber lot on the north end that would provide firewood and fence posts for years. She listened to all of it and then said, "Do it." He said, "It's a considerable commitment." She said, "Isaiah, do it." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said, which he occasionally said with a dryness that made her want to throw something at him, and was also, she had concluded, one of the things she loved most about him. The North 80 was purchased in August, in Annie's name. To be added to the Double C, Isaiah cleared the overgrown fence line on the north boundary and set new posts and strung new wire, and Eli helped him for the first time as a genuine working hand. He was 11 now and strong for his age, and had been paying close enough attention to Isaiah's fence work over the past year that he knew what he was doing. They worked the north boundary together over a week in August, the man and the boy, talking about cattle and soil and the almanac's predictions for the winter. And in the evenings they came back dusty and satisfied and ate Annie's cooking with the appetite of people who had used their bodies honestly. Annie watched them at the supper table and felt something so full and complete that it had no name she knew, not happiness, exactly, which was too small a word, but something closer to rightness, the sense of a thing fitting the shape that had been made for it. The baby came in October, on a Sunday, delivered by the Caldwell doctor who came out in his buggy, in response to Isaiah's hard-ridden summons at 3 in the morning. It was a boy. A big, healthy, furiously loud boy who arrived in the world with apparently strong objections to it, and let them be known at considerable volume. Isaiah sat outside the bedroom door through the whole of it in a state of barely contained terror that he managed with the same outward calm he brought to everything, which fooled no one, least of all Eli, who sat beside him and said, "She'll be fine. She's the strongest person I know." Isaiah put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "I know." He was right, and Eli was right, and Annie was fine, more than fine. When Isaiah was finally allowed into the room and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, She was radiant in the specific way of a woman who has done something difficult and come through the far side of it. And she looked at Isaiah holding this child and said, "Well." He looked at the baby, red-faced, enormous-lunged, presently sleeping after his early declarations, and felt something so profound move through him that he was briefly unable to speak, which was not a thing that often happened to Isaiah Dawson. "He looks like a rancher," he finally said. Annie made a sound that was laughter and exhaustion in equal measure. What should we call him? They had discussed names. They had made a short list. But now, looking at the child in Isaiah's arms, Annie said, "Thomas, if you don't mind." Isaiah looked at her. "Thomas Dawson. Thomas Isaiah Dawson," she said, "if you don't mind." He looked down at the baby and said softly, "Thomas Isaiah Dawson. That's a name that'll hold up." Eli, from the doorway where he had been hovering with poorly concealed impatience, said, "Can I come in?" They let him in, and he looked at his brother with an expression of complex mixed emotions that eventually resolved into something warm and surprised, and he said, "He's very loud for something so small." "You were exactly the same," Annie said. "Your father said you came into the world with a grievance." Eli considered this. "What was I grieved about?" "Thomas said you'd have to tell us when you figured it out." She smiled, and Isaiah looked at her smiling and thought that if he could hold any one moment from the last 2 years in perfect preservation, it would be this one, or maybe the one in the barn, or maybe the evening on the porch when they had first sat together watching the windmill turn. But probably this one, this kitchen warm room in October of 1881 with the baby sleeping, and the boy standing at the foot of the bed, and Annie Chandler, Annie Dawson, smiling in the lamplight. The winter that year was mild, as winters in Kansas sometimes are, full of clear cold days with sun so sharp and bright off the snow that you needed to shade your eyes to see across the pasture. Thomas Isaiah Dawson grew at a rate that suggested he intended to be large and loud for some time, and Eli took to carrying him around the house in the afternoons with a seriousness that Isaiah told Annie privately was one of the finest things he had ever seen. The note on the 80 acres was paid off by the spring of 1882, ahead of schedule, because the Wellington Railroad contract paid better than projected, and Isaiah had a particular discipline about money that came from years of understanding what it meant to have none. He had also, through the winter, written a formal complaint to the Cattle Association in San Antonio about acres and the withheld wages, supported by the careful records he had kept, and in March received a letter informing him that the matter had been reviewed and that a settlement would be paid, not the full amount, but 2/3 of it, which was more than he had realistically expected. He read the letter at the kitchen table on a March morning and sat quietly with it for a moment. Annie saw him and said, "Good news or bad?" "Good," he said. "Mostly good," he told her, and she listened, and when he was done she said, "You should have had all of it." "2/3 is enough," he said. "It means something that anyone looked at it at all." She sat across from him and looked at him directly. "It was wrong what that man did. The whole system that made it possible for him to do it is wrong." "Yes," he said, "it is. And I've known that every day of my life, and I've built what I can build within it and around it and sometimes despite it, because the alternative is to let it take everything." He looked at her steadily. "That's not giving in. That's survival with intention." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You're the most intentional man I know," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "And you're the stubbornest woman I have ever encountered in any territory of this country. And I mean that as the highest possible form of praise." She pressed her lips together over a smile. "Thank you," she said. The spring of 1882 brought a visitor to the Double C that none of them had anticipated: Isaiah's mother, Cecilia Dawson, who had made the trip from Louisville at the age of 62 on the railroad to Wichita, where Isaiah's cousin had met her and driven her out to Caldwell County. She was a small woman with a spine like a ramrod and eyes like her son's, deep and steady and containing multitudes. And she arrived on a Thursday afternoon in April carrying a large carpet bag and a tin of pralines she had made for the journey and had guarded so carefully they were still intact. Isaiah was in the pasture when she arrived and came running at Eli's shout, which was the only time Annie had ever seen him run without a clear emergency, and she watched from the porch as he reached his mother, and the two of them embraced with the fierce intensity of a reunion long overdue, and felt her eyes sting in a way she did not attempt to prevent. Isaiah Dawson spent 3 weeks at the Double C. She was a woman of remarkable practicality and warmth in equal measure. She reorganized Annie's larder on the second day, which Annie would have resented from anyone else, and accepted from Cecilia, with the understanding that she was being shown a better system, rather than criticized for the current one. She held Isaiah for hours at a stretch with the complete absorption of a grandmother discovering a grandchild for the first time, and told him long stories in a soft voice about his father as a boy that made Isaiah, overhearing from the doorway, shake his head and look at the ceiling. She sat with Annie on the porch one evening while the men, Isaiah and Eli, who had taken to the older woman with immediate warmth, were down at the barn checking the new spring calves, and she said, "He was always going to end up somewhere like this. He was always going to end up with someone like you." "Someone like me," Annie said. "Someone who doesn't need saving," Cecilia said. "He never could abide a woman who needed saving. It made him feel he was doing something wrong." She rocked the baby gently. What he needed was someone who needed no one, so that when he offered what he had to give, it meant something. Annie looked out over the pasture in the evening light. "I was very stubborn about not needing anything," she said. "Good thing, too," Cecilia said. "Otherwise he'd have knocked on your door like a normal man and probably said something too quiet, and you'd have thanked him and sent him away." She looked at Annie with bright amusement. Starting at the far end of the fence was his idea of a courtship strategy. Annie looked at her. "Did he plan it?" "Isaiah doesn't plan things he'd call plans," Cecilia said. "He makes decisions and then he acts on them." "He decided you were worth the fence and the time and the patience." She shrugged. "That's just how he is." Annie thought about the man working steadily from the far corner of her property toward her for 3 months, never asking, never demanding, just working. She thought about the first time she had walked down to confront him, and he had stood there with his pliers and answered her with complete calm. She thought about the food left on the rock and returned clean, and the bunkhouse with its swept floor, and the night on the porch with the windmill turning. "He's a good man," she said. "The best I know," Cecilia said simply, "and I raised him so I should know." When Isaiah Dawson left for Louisville at the end of April, she took the carpet bag and the tin. She had made more pralines at Annie's stove before she left, and she hugged Eli for a long time and told him he was a fine young man, and that she expected he would do great things, which Eli received with the seriousness of someone who intends to meet the expectation. She held Isaiah last and said something to him very quietly, and then handed him back to Annie and embraced Annie firmly. "Come see me in Louisville," she said. "We will," Annie said, and meant it. Isaiah drove her in the wagon to Caldwell to catch the stage to Wichita, and when he came back that evening he was quiet, and Annie let him be quiet, bringing him his supper and sitting beside him on the porch while Thomas slept in the basket inside and Eli did his evening reading at the table. "She looks well," he said finally. "She does," Annie agreed. "She liked you," he said. "I liked her." She paused. "She told me why you started at the far end of the fence." He looked over at her with a look that held, for just a moment, the sheepishness of a man whose mother has said too much. "What did she tell you?" "That you decided I was worth the fence," Annie said. That's just how you are." He was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," he said. Annie put her head on his shoulder in the way she had grown accustomed to, the way that had become the language of a full day ending and the world settling and the two of them present to it together. He put his arm around her. "Thank you," she said, "for starting at the far end." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair. "Thank you for letting me work my way in," he said. The years that followed on the Double C were years of accumulation, of cattle and children, of repaired things and new things built from scratch, of seasons measured by calving and planting and harvest, and the slow turning of the Kansas sky from spring's pale blue to summer's white-hot blaze to autumn's liquid gold. Thomas Isaiah grew from a loud infant into a solidly built boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's jaw, determined and observant and fond of following Eli around the ranch, with the devotion of a younger sibling who has decided his older brother contains all knowledge worth knowing. Eli turned 13 in 1883 and began working the ranch as a full partner in everything but name. He had a natural instinct for cattle that Isaiah cultivated with the patience he brought to all things, and by 14, he could read a herd the way Thomas Chandler had read a room, with a quick, deep understanding that came from somewhere below conscious thought. Isaiah taught him to brand and to doctor and to move cattle over distance and to read weather and to keep books, and Annie looked at the two of them coming in from the south pasture in the evenings and felt the fullness of a life built well by people who had chosen each other. In 1884, Annie was delivered of a daughter, who arrived on a cold January morning with considerably more equanimity than her brother had shown 3 years earlier, and who they named Cecilia Ruth Dawson, Cecilia for Isaiah's mother, Ruth for Annie's. She had Annie's coloring and Isaiah's patience, which combined into a child of considerable serenity who watched the world with enormous calm eyes and reached conclusions of her own without apparent effort. Isaiah's cousin from Wichita came down for the christening in February and brought his wife and their 2 children, and the house on the Double C was fuller than it had ever been, and Annie cooked for 8 adults and 4 children over 3 days, and emerged from it with a satisfaction that she would not have predicted from herself in the solitary years. The note on the original Double C land had been paid since 1880. The note on the North 80 was paid. The cattle operation had grown to a size that required occasional hired hands in the busy seasons, men Isaiah vetted with the care of someone who understood what was at stake and chose well. The ledger that Annie kept every evening showed numbers she would not have believed in 1879, not wealthy numbers, not the kind that meant anything except that the land was secure and the family was fed, and there was something in reserve for whatever Kansas decided to send. In the spring of 1885, the banker Holloway died, and his successor at the Caldwell Bank was a younger man named Archer who rode out to the Double C on a social call and found himself profoundly impressed, which he communicated in the awkward way of men who expect less and find more, and are not quite sure how to revise their expectations gracefully. Isaiah received him with the cool courtesy of a man who does not require other people's impressions to define his own understanding of his worth, and Annie offered him coffee and a slice of pie and let him adjust at his own pace. Eli, who was 15 and tall and had more of Thomas Chandler in his bearing every year, shook the banker's hand with a directness the banker was clearly not prepared for, and little Thomas, age 3, informed Archer that they had 17 cows and a bull named General Information. Archer filed away with the expression of a man filing away more than he expected. Cecilia, barely a year old, sat in Annie's lap and looked at Archer with her large, calm eyes and passed her own judgment in silence. That evening, after the banker had gone and the children were in bed, Annie and Isaiah sat on the porch in the May warmth and listened to the windmill turning, as they had done so many times now that the sound was the sound of peace itself. "He'll be back," Isaiah said. "He will," Annie agreed. "He wants to offer us a line of credit for an additional purchase." "I heard him thinking about it," Isaiah said. "He was looking at the North 80 when I took him through the gate." "The land east of the creek is available," Annie said. "The homesteader who had it went back to Ohio. It's another 120 acres and it has good water." "It does," Isaiah said. "We could do it," she said. He turned to look at her. "We could," he said, "if you want to." She looked back at him with those winter sage eyes that had assessed him from a rise one morning in April of 1880 and found him, apparently, worth coming down the slope for. I want this ranch to be something Eli and Thomas and Cecilia can stand on when we're gone, she said. Something solid enough to hold them. Then we'll talk to Archer, he said. She nodded and looked back out at the dark pasture where the cattle moved as shadows in the moonlight, the herd that had grown from the depleted remnant she had been trying to hold together alone into something real and sustainable. The windmill turned. The crickets ran their night chorus. Thomas Isaiah made a small sound from inside the house, the sleep sound of a child shifting in his bed, and was quiet again. Isaiah, she said, I'm glad you stopped at my fence. He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the smile in it before she saw it. I'm glad you let me keep going, he said. She took his hand in the dark, his broad, rough hand that had set fence posts and fixed windmills, and repaired everything broken on this land. The hand that had held their son for the first time and steadied her on the hard days, and been present for all of it with the same unfailing quality that she had first seen in him across 300 yards of Kansas grassland, and had been unable to look away from since. She held it and he held hers, and the night moved over the double sea in its slow, vast arc. The East Creek land was purchased in the autumn of 1885, and the fence lines went in that winter and spring, and Isaiah did not work them from the far end alone this time. Eli worked one side and Isaiah the other, and Thomas, age 4 and entirely convinced of his own competence, carried fence staples in a tin bucket and distributed them at intervals with solemn authority. By the summer of 1886, the Double C occupied 540 acres of Caldwell County, Kansas. It ran a herd of 62 head. Its fence lines were taut and true. Its barn roof was sound. Its windmill turned on 8 blades in the west wind. Its kitchen garden, properly irrigated, produced more than the family could eat, and Annie Chandler Dawson put up preserves in August with the efficiency of a woman who has never once wasted anything in her life. The house had been added to a proper parlor on the south side that Isaiah and Eli had built over the winter of 1884, with a window that looked out toward the creek, and a bookcase that held Annie's Tennyson and the McGuffey readers, and a growing number of volumes that Isaiah ordered from a bookseller in Wichita. On topics ranging from agricultural methods to the history of the American West, to a volume of Frederick Douglass that he kept on the top shelf and read sections of aloud to the children on Sunday evenings, with the same care Annie gave to Tennyson. Eli read the Douglass himself by the time he was 14 and asked his stepfather questions about it for a week. Isaiah answered every one of them with the same calm clarity he had brought to Eli's questions about fence posts and buffalo and North Stars, and the boy absorbed it all and grew into a young man with a clear view of his country and its obligations and its failures and its possibilities, which was about the most useful thing a person could carry into the world. The Double C was known in Caldwell County by 1886 as a sound operation run by a capable family. There were still people who had opinions about what the family looked like, and those opinions were occasionally voiced in ways that ranged from the merely ignorant to the actively hostile, and Annie and Isaiah navigated all of them with the practiced steadiness of people who have decided what matters and calibrated everything else accordingly. There were also friends, the Brechts, who had become genuinely close over the years. Miss Pierce, who had stayed in Caldwell and married the hardware merchant and remained fond of the Dawson family. Isaiah's cousin from Wichita, who visited twice a year and stayed a week each time, and a small number of neighbors and acquaintances who measured people by what they did and found the Dawsons measured well. On the morning of their 6th wedding anniversary, in November of 1886, Isaiah woke early and went out to the south fence line. He stood at the corner post, the first post he had set, that first week in April of 1880, before Annie had come down from the rise to confront him. The post was still solid, cedar still holding its hardness in the earth, the wire still taut beside it. He put his hand on the post and felt the grain of it, the 6 years of weather that had gone into it, and looked east from the corner across the full length of the south line, the fence running true in the morning light. He heard her coming before he saw her, the sound of her boots in the dry grass, the rhythm of her walking that he knew, the way you know music you have heard so many times it is part of you. He turned and she came along the fence line toward him, her coat buttoned against the November cold, her breath a small cloud in the cold air, her hair not yet pinned for the day. "I knew you'd be here," she said. "Did you?" "I've known where you were every morning for 6 years," she said. "It's not difficult." He looked at her, this woman who had stood on a rise watching him for 10 minutes and put her chin up and gone back to her garden, who had put food on a flat rock and never acknowledged it until it was returned clean, who had stood across a barn workbench and said, "I think I might love you," with the directness of someone who has decided that honesty is the only thing worth offering, who had married him in November and kept books through the winter and sold 5 steers at the market and paid a note and added 80 acres and had 2 children and put up preserves and read Tennyson to them every night and looked at the world with those winter sage eyes that missed nothing. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Happy anniversary," she said. She came to stand beside him at the corner post, and they both looked east along the fence line, the wire catching the early light, the post set straight and true across the good Kansas ground. "You fixed it from here," she said. "I did," he said. "And then you kept going," she said. "I did," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the corner of the south fence on the double C in the November morning, while somewhere behind them the house waited with its warm stove and its sleeping children and its good smells and its bookcase full of Tennyson and Douglas, and the ledger with its solid numbers, and the life they had made together from the far end of a broken fence line, working steadily toward each other, and then past the finding of each other, into the territory beyond it that turns out to be the better country after all. The windmill turned in the distance, all 8 blades catching the wind. The cattle moved in the south pasture with the unhurried dignity of animals that have everything they need. The sky above the Kansas plains was the pale, clean blue of a November morning that has something good in it yet, and Annie Chandler Dawson and Isaiah Dawson stood at the corner post and held each other and said nothing at all, because everything had already been said, was being said every day in the way they worked and ate and slept and raised their children and tended their land. And the saying of it, in all those quiet, persistent ways, was the best and truest kind.